Okay, so yeah, BPMN, is that still a thing? Scott, Lance, Krista asked me to cover this topic for you. And more importantly, is it still important to automation work within the enterprise? So before we talk about BPMN, how important it is or isn't within the enterprise and automation, let's first frame exactly what we're talking about. So the first question is, what is BPMN? Quite simply, BPMN, these acronyms are not fun to say over and over again, so I will stumble here, but it stands for Business Process Modeling Notation. So now that we've cleared that up, the people who aren't using it all know exactly what it is, and we can just move on, right? Maybe not. So let me go just a little bit deeper with regards to BPMN. So again, Andrew, what is BPMN? Well, it's an example of what's known as a domain-specific language, which is just more jargon, so I'm not helping you yet. So you don't really know what that means either. So let's go a little bit deeper. What is a domain-specific language? A domain-specific language is generally contrasted with general languages or general-purpose languages. English is a general language. It can be used to convey or obfuscate information on a very wide range of topics. From a programming perspective, most well-known languages are considered general languages and not domain-specific. C, Java, JavaScript, Ruby, these can all be used to create solutions across a full set of domains. A domain-specific language is one that is tailored to convey a very specific types of information or solve a very specific set of problems. SQL, or simple query language, is an example of a language that is focused on one thing: accessing data in a relational database. So, BPMN is a language specifically designed to capture business process solutions using a notational approach. So that's what we're talking about today. Now, let's take a moment and talk about the advantages to using BPMN. First, it's graphical or notational. There are lots of examples. We've all heard a picture's worth 1,000 words in similar sayings. There are a lot of examples where the common belief is that representing data in a graphical manner is far superior to using prose. If you were going to build a house and asked the architect to give you a copy of the plans for the house, and they handed you a set of hundreds of pages of prose write-up, you'd probably think they may not know what they're doing, and you wouldn't want to pick that design. An architecture diagram is an example of a domain-specific modeling language. And as you sort of intuitively grasp, you can understand what that model is conveying much more easily because it's graphical than if it was just written prose. While architecture diagrams aren't today used to automate construction, there is a domain-specific notational language represented there. Just as you wouldn't hire an architect who wrote up their design in prose, if someone describes their process like this, instead of like this, it is likely that their design is open to confusion, misinterpretation, and honestly is going to be very difficult for people to understand. Another advantage of a modeling language is that it unlocks a variety of tools. Now, while my handwriting in this may be very difficult for you to comprehend, especially through a WebEx or Zoom, a BPM compliant diagram can be created with just some simple drawing tools. By preference, prior to everything that's been going on, whiteboards were commonly used in our office when people needed to get to an agreement. While electronic tools are useful and are recommended, for collaboration in the moment while in a room and reaching consensus, whiteboard and marker is likely far more useful than attempting to convey every detail you're trying to capture by writing down words. Another advantage with BPMN is that it is standards-based. This means that if you're using a diagram to capture and document a process, the execution following that diagram should be consistent. This is true if you're just using the diagram to manually track your steps, or if you've automated the entire process in a tool. All the tools that are BPMN compliant have the same understanding of what the diagram represents. If you're attempting to capture a process and you're not using BPMN, especially if you're using a vendor-specific tool, you're likely to have a problem if you ever want to try to move that process that you have captured into a different technology. The last advantage I want to talk about is the fact that BPMN is constrained. While you may not initially think of a language being constrained as being an advantage, it can be considered one. Here is an example of someone's attempt to capture a process without the use of BPMN, using simple drawing tools. Again, the tool that was used is a generalized tool that could capture any sort of drawing you wanted. There are any number of problems with this representation. Where does the process actually end? Who's responsible for the various steps? Who are all the participants? How do we decide which step is followed after hitting the artificial intelligence step? And the fact is that since BPMN is constrained to solving only process problems, it forces you to capture this information correctly and clearly. And once captured that way, the solution can be well understood. These constraints are also good because if you are attempting to capture or solve a problem and you find that you cannot represent that problem accurately in BPMN, then this is a strong indicator that you may not be solving a process problem. Okay, so BPMN, it's been declared dead many, many times by various people. Is it in fact dead?
So let's go ahead and see what our participants think. So we'll go ahead and launch a poll and say, do you believe that BPMN is dead? We have a good question in the Q&A right now. What is DMN, or decision modeling notation, and why do you need it if you already use BPMN? And I think that you just answered that, Andrew, so if you just wanted to repeat yourself there.
Well, yeah, so it is another modeling notation, and it's a domain-specific language for capturing decision data. So if you are trying to figure out a decision, how do we make this decision? What are the right steps? What's the data required for it? Then DMN is likely the right tool to be doing that, especially if you want to capture it in some sort of graphical representation that people can understand relatively easily. We actually very frequently wind up having these two technologies intersect one another, because when decisions in a process become complex, something like a decision solution is what we'd want to move towards, especially if the business wants to have better control over how that decision evolves over time.
So,
all right, so there's,
go
ahead, Chris.
So it looks like everyone pretty much agrees here that BPMN is very important. I think there were two people that just wanted to put a fork in it. So, you know, but then we have another question here before we go further, which is, can BPMN handle case or ad hoc use cases, or do you need to use CMMN, which is case modeling notation, case management modeling notation?
I'll actually, that touches on a point that I'll make in a little bit, but case and process are different things, and you should use the appropriate tool for the problem that you're trying to solve. A lot of the process solutions have brought in some case entities, but if what you're really, really doing is case, you very well may want to look at a case modeling tool.
I think you're going to hit the question in this section, but what level of detail do my BPMN diagrams need to be? I think you're about to hit that, so I'll leave that one and we can come back and circle back and answer that one. So go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. So when I was researching all this, trying to pull things together, W. Edwards Demings, who was a big person early in both QA and process, had a quote that I really liked was, if you cannot define what you're doing as a process, you don't actually understand what you're doing. And he was mainly coming from a quality standpoint. So we do need to understand process. But I said, no, BPMN is not dead, but let's prove it. So let's start with the fact that very few technologies are ever actually replaced. One researcher took a Sears catalog from the late 1800s with trying to see how many of the things in the catalog were no longer manufactured. In every case that they looked at in that catalog, they were able to source a current manufacturer for the item in question. I've often heard someone making a snide comment about buggy whip manufacturers. But the reality is they're still out there today and creating buggy whips. And I'm willing to bet if you're someone who is actually doing the sort of work or races where buggy whips are required, they probably get very pricey and very specific. I've also encountered gardeners from some previous generations who swear that this is still the best way to get the dirt out of their gardening clothes. So given that we can find these things on Amazon, we can see that they haven't gone away, even though there's other options. COBOL, in our own domain space, COBOL is now over 60 years old and had an OO enhancement added to it within the last 10 years. We may all agree that it shouldn't be in use, but the reality is it's still here. Fortran is almost 70 years old. I couldn't believe that when I found that out. And some math professors still insist that it's better for what they do than any modern language. So this brings up a good point. COBOL and Fortran aren't being heavily used today, but we do have replacements for them. So what are the replacements that may be BPMN killers? So this is sort of queued up. Case. Most case management practitioners use case management modeling notation, or CMMN, to capture the details of the case. And case management certainly has its place. And there are very many similarities between case and process because each of them deal with allowing users to understand the tasks to be done and execute those tasks. However, the methodology behind the two is greatly different. Whenever anyone asks me about case, I actually immediately think of the television show House, where they are actually working a case. In the case situation, an expert practitioner has a number of different things they could choose to do, and they select from there the appropriate ones based on the data that they've already understood. It is a very much an expert-driven type of approach. Process, on the other hand, puts most of the weight of deciding what is to be done next on the process itself, and asks the participants to know how to execute each of their tasks very well and to a great level of detail, but doesn't make them have to understand what comes next or what comes before, with the exception of the cases where we ask a human to make a decision because we're unable to capture that decision appropriately using an automated technique.
Andrew,
so case didn't kill.
If I can add one thought to that, if you're sitting at home and you've written code before in various languages, one analogy to use is, case management is declarative in approach, more like Prolog, whereas BPMN is more directive in approach, so more procedural. And for some people, their brains will naturally gravitate toward one way of representing a problem or the other. And for the most part, I think you could represent fully both kinds of problems with CMMN or with BPMN, but you may find that one or the other feels a lot more natural to you, or that the problem fits better in one or the other, regardless of which one feels more natural.
All right, so what's the next BPMN killer? I've heard RPA. Some analysts have been saying that. And while process is in the name of RPA, it's sitting right there, most RPA solutions today are focused on solving what BPM view as individual tasks within a process. And we, BP3, actually have delivered many RPA solutions that are behaving more like business processes, with coordinating tasks across multiple bots and even with a human involved to achieve their business goal. It isn't a natural fit for that tool. It actually feels a lot like where the BPM solutions were approximately 16 years ago, before they really started adopting BPMN. To that point, I actually expect to see most RPA vendors, as they move into a more business process focused space, to start to adopt BPMN as their modeling approach, because they're able to leverage the 20+ years of discovery and academic research that's gone into it.
So Andrew, this is a good chance for a Q&A that we have, is how do I stop my BPMN diagrams from just being documentation that I need to maintain?
I actually touched on that on the end of this as well. But so when you are looking at a process and its maturity, there's two things that are important in understanding about your processes. You have a process if it's been documented, or if it's been standardized. If you have one of those two, you have a process. If you don't have either, it's not standardized and it's not documented, you probably don't really know what your process is. And you're back in that Deming, you don't really understand what you're doing. If you want to move out of the pure documentation, you need to make sure that you're living it, and you need to examine where are the areas that automation makes sense. So I have seen documented processes that when you get to the people who are working the process, they actually don't even know that the process exists. The analogy I always think of is one comedian has a whole routine about being an ant on a car tire, right? The person's an ant on a car tire. They don't even realize that they're on a car tire until it crushes them. Same thing with these workers. They don't know that they're in a process unless it winds up affecting them in a negative way. So we need to make sure that if there's a process, we're not just documenting it, but we're living it, and that we're empowering people to figure out how can we make this process better, where are the places that we can come in and improve it, and it's not just shelf documentation. Okay. So our next RPA killer, our BPMN killer, sorry, looking at my screen, low code, no code. So interestingly, when I went out to look for low code, no code, the first things I get are these images that actually look a lot like BPMN. But a lot like RPA, I don't think process is in their DNA. I think when you're using low code, no code to solve problems, you're still in that making an individual task better, much like RPA is, or maybe a series of automated tasks, but you're not really coordinating a true process with multiple participants, multiple systems, and those sorts of things. If these tools actually grow into that point, I would expect their diagrams to start to become BPMN compliant, because we have yet to find a better way to really represent those things. The big question there is that they actually feel that solving those problems is in their tooling and in their domain space. The last BPMN killer, walled garden solutions. Many of these large enterprise software companies have started adding process to their solutions, but process is not really in their DNA. And even with some of these who BP3 have actually consulted with in order for their product owners to understand how to add process to their solution, we're seeing resistance to leveraging the 20+ years of academic research on how to properly capture business solutions. I think Scott and Lance will be touching on a lot of these things in more detail. But if these vendors are resistant to using BPMN for capturing your process, I would question whether they properly understand the domain space that they're trying to solve. So I hope this actually lends people to understand BPMN in a little more detail, and its importance in process automation, and the importance in using it to improve your organization and their processes. I think that's it for my presentation.
Cool. So, Andrew, for some of these tools, like my impression is that they don't use BPMN to represent process, right? How do you even think about implementing, a process with tools that don't use BPMN?
Well, like I said, actually, if we go all the way back to the Lombardi software version 3 and 4 that you and I use, Scott, even though there was no way to get a BPMN diagram, you can wind up solving a process problem with almost any tool. We could solve it with a general purpose language. The big concern I have with doing that is it hasn't been solved in a way that it can be conveyed to someone who isn't deeply nested into that tool. So if someone asks you, even in the cases where we've used RPA to implement what effectively winds up being a business process, none of our people can hand a business diagram that's part of the tooling to the customer to show what they are. Interestingly, I know that our RPA group has actually started using some of the BPMN tooling to document the process before they implement the RPA so that they can show that interaction and where the different bots are going to participate, how we solve the overall problem. So that's why I think, it's just the right place to do it, even if you wind up having to implement using a different technology.
Right. Well, that's great commentary. And thank you, Andrew,